So there's several methods of actually breaking down a semi-variable cost into its fixed and variable components. We're really going to just touch on one method to illustrate the concept, but there are several methods you could use. There's scatter graphs, there's least squares regression, and then the method we're going to go over is the high-low method. And the reason we're actually wanting to break our costs into two components is because to prepare a flexible budget, we need to have all our variable costs in one bucket and all our fixed costs in another bucket. So the first step to actually getting to where we can prepare a flexible budget is to break down all of our costs into either fixed or variable. So if you weren't easily able to break your costs down into fixed and variable just by looking at the makeup of your different costs, you would use one of the methods, such as the high-low method, to break your costs down. As we mentioned earlier when we were talking about different examples, in the business world, to break these down, if you wanted to look at your utility bill, you take a look at that and see if there is a baseline amount that's fixed, and then figure out if there is a per kilowatt hour that's variable. So you would actually be able to use source documents in many cases to determine what part of the cost was variable and what part of it was fixed. In some cases where you're not able to clearly do that by looking at source documents, you'd want to use some type of estimation method. And the high-low method is one of those estimation methods that you use to break costs down. So the high-low method is kind of what it sounds like. You're going to select two data points, the highest and lowest volume point. So you'll be given an amount of data, and okay, we produced this many units in this month, and that was our cost in this month. We produced this many units in the next month, that was our cost in that month. So you'd be looking at possibly an entire year's worth of data, and out of that entire year, you'd go to your highest and your lowest volume or highest and lowest activity level point, and you'd pick those 2 points to apply this method with. Then you're going to calculate the variable rate, then calculate the variable cost, and then the third step is that you're going to subtract that variable cost from the total cost to find the fixed component. So if we look at this, this is our formula for our variable rate. We're going to find our 2 points. Then we're going to look at the difference in cost between those 2 points. Then we're going to divide that by the difference in activity between those 2 points. So let's look at an example to explain this a little bit better. So this is an example. In this example, the cost that we want to break down is our factory overhead. So that's the cost that we're going to be looking to break down into a variable component and a fixed component. And the activity that we're going to use is direct labor hours. So you can either choose to break something down by number of units produced or by some type of activity, what we call a cost driver. So what we're choosing in this example is breaking down our factory overhead by the activity level of our direct labor hours. So this is similar to the example in your textbook on page 122 through 123. So you've got your chart here, and your data that you need to do this exercise are you're going to need to have some level of activity or volume, and then you're going to need to have a corresponding cost. So you could do this by quarter, by month, by week, by some other measure, but what you need are your activity or volume levels and your costs that you want to break down. So if we're looking at this chart, we've got 4 quarters, and quarter 1, we used 440 direct labor hours, and our factory overhead cost was $27,000. Quarter 2, we used 510 direct labor hours, and our factory overhead cost was $30,000. Same thing for quarter 3, quarter 4, you can see the numbers. You want to look at your activity or volume column and find your lowest level activity and your highest level of activity. Well, if we look at this, we can see our lowest was 440 and our highest was 660. So these are the 2 points we're going to pick. We're going to pick a point at which our direct labor hours were 440 and the corresponding cost was $27,000. And we're going to pick the highest point at which our direct labor hours were 660 and our corresponding cost was $38,000. So once we have that highest point picked and that lowest point picked, we're going to calculate our variable rate. And remember that our variable rate is the difference in cost for our 2 points divided by the difference in activity for our 2 points. So here's our difference in cost, our 38,000, subtract our 27,000. That's our difference in cost on the top here. Our difference in activity or volume level is going to go on the bottom. So we're going to take our highest, 660, minus 440. So once you do that calculation, you're going to get that it's $50 per direct labor hour. And just to touch on that again, we took our highest point, subtracted our lowest point. Keep clicking that button. We took our highest point in cost, subtracted our lowest cost. We took our highest point in activity level, subtracted the lowest activity level. Divided, and that's our resulting rate is $50 per direct labor hour. So as we use 1 direct labor hour, our factory overhead cost is going to increase by $50 per hour. So we're going to continue on the next slide. So after we have our variable rate, then we're going to want to determine our total variable cost. So our variable rate from the prior slide was $50 per direct labor hour, where you're going to apply that rate to one of these points. And I will point out that it does not matter which of these points you select. You just need to be consistent and use the same point all the way through the exercise. So in this first example, I'm just going to use my lowest point. So I multiply my $50 times my 440 hours, and I get that my variable cost during quarter 1 would have been $22,000. So once I have my variable cost, I can then calculate my fixed cost. And to do that, I take my total cost at that same point. Remember, I'm sticking with my lowest point. So I'm going to take $27,000 as my total cost. And I'm going to subtract out my variable cost of $22,000. So there's my $27,000, which was my total cost. Here's my variable cost of $22,000 that I got up here. Once I subtract that variable cost from the total cost, I'm going to get a fixed cost of $5,000. And if I actually had gone through and done that with the highest points, I would have gotten the same result for fixed. Because remember, fixed doesn't change with volume. So you'll get a different variable amount, but the fixed amount will always come out the same. Just make sure you're consistent with whichever point you pick. So once I determine that my fixed cost is $5,000, I'd write this formula out. This would be my cost volume formula for factory overhead. $5,000 fixed plus $50 per direct labor hour. So this is my variable cost. $50 is my rate multiplied by my direct labor hour. So let's use that cost volume formula we just calculated in our prior example to apply towards flexible budget. Flexible budget is adjusted to whatever our actual activity level or our actual number of units produced is. So we could find out what our factory overhead should be if the company uses 550 direct labor hours. So in our example, we're going to follow our cost volume formula, which is total cost equals fixed cost plus variable cost. And in our example, that's going to be 5,000 fixed cost plus our variable rate of $50 multiplied by the actual direct labor hours we used in the coming month. So this example, we're going to multiply by 550 direct labor hours. This gives us a result of 32,500. So we're now able to use this formula to flex our budget and determine what factory overhead should be if we use 550 direct labor hours.